If you're new to the channel, take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like Jon's that I'm about to share might change how you see the world around you. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The missing watch was the final straw. Jon Jones stood in his walk-in closet, running his hands through his thinning hair as he stared at the empty spot on his dresser where his father's Rolex had sat just yesterday. It wasn't particularly valuable. The face was scratched and the band had been replaced twice, but it was the last thing his father had given him before the cancer took him. Jon had noticed small things disappearing over the past few months. A pair of cufflinks, some cash from his desk drawer, a silver fountain pen his grandfather had given him for his law school graduation, and now this. The only person who had access to his home besides himself was Maria, the housekeeper who'd worked for him for the past 8 months. Jon had hired Maria shortly after his divorce was finalized. After 15 years of marriage, Caroline had left, taking their daughter Emma with her to start a new life 3 states away. The sprawling suburban home that had once echoed with laughter now felt cavernous and empty. Jon had thrown himself into his work as a corporate attorney, often working 14-hour days, leaving little time or energy for household chores. Maria had seemed like a godsend, quiet, efficient, and thorough. Her references had checked out, and she'd always been professional, keeping to herself and leaving the house spotless. But now, as Jon stared at the empty spot where his father's watch should be, doubt crept in like a shadow. The rational part of Jon's brain told him to simply confront her, or maybe call the police. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of another broken relationship, another person he couldn't trust. Or maybe it was the memory of Maria's eyes, dark brown and always downcast, as if carrying some invisible weight. Jon had barely spoken more than a few sentences to her at a time in all these months. He realized with a pang of guilt that he knew almost nothing about the woman who entered his home 3 times a week. Jon moved to his bedroom window, watching as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his perfectly manicured lawn. The neighborhood was quiet, affluent, the kind of place where people believed they were insulated from the uglier aspects of life. He thought back to the first time he had interviewed Maria, how her hands had trembled slightly as she'd handed over her references, how she had seemed almost surprised when he'd offered her the job on the spot. There had been gratitude in her eyes then, a flash of something vulnerable that had made him uncomfortable enough to look away, to busy himself with paperwork rather than acknowledge it. Instead of confrontation, Jon made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow was Thursday, one of Maria's regular days. He would call in sick to work and follow her after she left his house. If she was stealing from him, perhaps she was stealing from others, or selling the items somewhere. The thought of catching her in the act gave him a strange sense of satisfaction. At least then he would know for certain. That night, Jon barely slept. He kept seeing his father's face, remembered the day he'd received the watch as a graduation gift. "Time is the only thing you can't get back, son," his father had said, fastening it around Jon's wrist. "Spend it wisely." Jon wondered what his father would think of how he'd spent his time since then, building a career while his marriage crumbled, now alone in a house too big for one person, suspecting the only other human who regularly entered his space of betrayal. When he did drift off, his dreams were fragmented, uneasy. He saw Caroline packing her suitcases, her face set in that determined look she'd worn for months before finally leaving. "You're never really here, Jon," she'd said. "Even when you're physically present, you're somewhere else." He dreamed of Emma, 14 now and growing distant with each passing month, her texts becoming shorter, her video calls less frequent. In his dream, she was wearing his father's watch, but when she raised her arm to wave goodbye, it slipped off, falling into an abyss that opened between them. Morning came with grey skies threatening rain. Jon dressed casually in jeans and a dark hoodie, clothes he never wore to the office. He made a show of leaving at his usual time, driving around the block and parking a few streets over, before walking back and letting himself in through the side entrance. He settled in his home office, door slightly ajar, listening to the familiar sounds of Maria arriving, the jingle of her keys, the soft thud of her bag being set down in the kitchen. For 3 hours, Jon sat in tense silence, catching up on emails while straining to hear any unusual sounds from the rest of the house. Maria moved with practiced efficiency, the vacuum humming, water running, the faint lemon scent of cleaning products wafting under the door. Several times Jon nearly abandoned his plan, feeling foolish for hiding in his own home. But then he would glance at his bare wrist where his father's watch should be, and his resolve would harden. At one point, Maria's footsteps approached his office. Jon held his breath, heart pounding as she paused outside the door. Would she enter, discover him there? What would he say? The moment stretched, taut with possibility, before her footsteps continued down the hall. Jon exhaled slowly, realizing his hands were clenched into fists. Was this what his life had come to? Hiding in his own home, spying on his housekeeper? There was something undeniably sordid about it, something that made him feel both powerful and pathetic simultaneously. Finally, he heard Maria gathering her things. He waited until the front door closed before moving to the window, watching as she walked to the bus stop at the end of his street. Jon grabbed his car keys and followed at a distance. The suburban landscape gave way to progressively less affluent neighborhoods as Maria transferred from one bus to another. Jon followed carefully, keeping his distance, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with his amateur surveillance operation. The morning rain had started, light at first but gradually intensifying until it drummed against the roof of his luxury sedan. Through the rhythmic sweep of his windshield wipers, Jon watched Maria standing at a bus stop, her shoulders hunched against the downpour, no umbrella in sight. For a moment, he considered offering her a ride, then remembered why he was following her in the first place. The thought of his father's watch, possibly already sold or pawned, hardened his heart once more. After nearly an hour, Maria disembarked in a working-class neighborhood of small, tightly packed houses with chain-link fences and cars parked on patches of lawn. Jon watched as she walked briskly down a cracked sidewalk and turned into the yard of a small blue bungalow. He parked across the street, uncertainty washing over him. What exactly was he doing here? What did he expect to find? The rain had eased to a drizzle, beading on the windshield. Jon observed the house, paint peeling around the window frames, a sagging front porch with a single plastic chair, a few brave marigolds struggling in a small patch of garden. It was a stark contrast to his own home with its professional landscaping and freshly painted trim. The disparity made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Before he could reconsider, Maria emerged from the house again, this time accompanied by an older woman who moved slowly, leaning heavily on Maria's arm. The woman's hair was silver and thin, her body frail, her steps uncertain. Maria helped her into an aging sedan parked in the driveway, carefully securing her in the passenger seat before walking around to the driver's side. Jon ducked down as they drove past, then impulsively decided to continue following. They drove to a medical building with a sign that read, Valley Oncology Center. Jon's stomach tightened. He knew this place, had spent countless hours here with his father during his final months. He watched from the parking lot as Maria gently helped the older woman from the car and into the building. Through the large windows, he could see them checking in at the reception desk before disappearing down a hallway. Memories flooded back with unexpected force, his father growing thinner by the week, the chemotherapy that had left him vomiting. And weak, the way his once robust voice had faded to a whisper. Jon remembered the astronomical bills, how grateful he'd been for good insurance and his partner-level salary that had made the financial aspect, at least, manageable. He remembered the small kindnesses of the nurses, the way one had always brought his father an extra blanket without being asked, knowing how the treatments left him perpetually cold. Jon sat in his car, the air suddenly thick with memories of his father's illness. The sterile smell of the treatment rooms, the quiet dignity with which his father had faced his diminishing strength, the helplessness Jon had felt, watching him slip away. He wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there when Maria and the older woman emerged. The woman looked exhausted, leaning more heavily on Maria than before. With infinite patience, Maria helped her back into the car. Instead of returning to the blue house, they drove to a pharmacy, where Maria went inside alone, returning with a white paper bag that she placed carefully in the older woman's lap. Their next stop was a grocery store. Jon, feeling increasingly like a voyeur intruding on something private, watched as Maria efficiently filled a cart with items, checked out, and loaded the bags into the trunk of the car. Through the plate-glass windows of the store, Jon could see Maria counting out cash at the register, carefully sorting through bills, ultimately returning a few items to the cashier when the total apparently exceeded her budget. The scene struck Jon with unexpected force. How many times had he bought whatever he wanted without a second thought? When was the last time he'd even looked at a price tag? When they returned to the blue house, Jon made a decision. He waited until they were inside, before approaching the door. His heart hammered in his chest as he rang the doorbell. What would he say? How would he explain his presence? Before he could sort out his thoughts, the door opened, and Maria stood before him, her eyes widening in shock. "Mr. Jones," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was fear in her eyes, and something else. Resignation, perhaps. "Maria," Jon said, suddenly at a loss for words. I need to talk to you." She glanced over her shoulder, then stepped outside, pulling the door nearly closed behind her. "Is something wrong with the house?" she asked, her accent more pronounced than usual, hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "No," Jon said. "It's about some items that have gone missing, including my father's watch." Maria's face drained of color. She looked down at her worn sneakers, then back up at Jon, her lips trembling slightly. "Please," she said softly. "I can explain, but not here." Before Jon could respond, a thin voice called from inside the house. "Maria, ¿quién está ahí?" "It's nothing, Mama," Maria called back in English. "A friend from work. I'll be right." She turned back to Jon, her eyes pleading. "Mr. Jones, please, give me 1 hour to get my mother settled, and I will come to your house and explain everything, I promise." Jon looked at the nearly closed door, thought of the frail woman he'd seen at the oncology center, and nodded slowly. 1 hour, he said, suddenly aware of the rain soaking through his hoodie, plastering his hair to his forehead. The drive back to his home was a blur. Jon's mind raced with possibilities. If Maria was stealing from him, why would she agree to meet? What possible explanation could there be? He paced his living room, rehearsing what he would say, how he would respond to whatever story she offered. The righteous indignation that had fueled his surveillance operation was fading, replaced by a growing unease. The image of Maria counting out bills at the grocery store of her mother's frail form kept intruding on his thoughts. Jon made coffee, showered, changed into dry clothes. He found himself standing in front of the family photos he still kept on the mantel. Caroline smiling on their wedding day, Emma gap-toothed and beaming at 8 years old, his father robust and healthy before the cancer. When had he last really looked at these images? When had he last allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost? True to her word, Maria arrived exactly 1 hour later. She stood on his doorstep looking smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her hands clutching her purse. The rain had started again, and droplets clung to her hair like tiny crystals. Jon let her in, leading her to the kitchen where they sat across from each other at the island counter. For a long moment neither spoke. "You followed me today," Maria finally said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. Jon nodded, not bothering to deny it. "I noticed things missing. Valuable things." Maria closed, her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was a quiet dignity in her gaze. "Yes," she said simply. "I took your watch and the cufflinks and some cash. I was going to bring them back." "Bring them back?" Jon repeated incredulously. "You were borrowing them?" "No," Maria said, meeting his gaze directly now. "I pawned them for money for my mother's medication. The insurance, it doesn't cover everything, and the treatments are very expensive." Jon thought of the oncology center, the frail woman leaning on Maria's arm. "Your mother has cancer." Maria nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Pancreatic, stage 4, the doctors say maybe 6 months, but with the right medication, she doesn't have to suffer so much." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the counter to Jon. "This is the pawn ticket. I was going to get the watch back first after I got paid next week. It was wrong, I know this. I can work extra to pay you back everything." Jon unfolded the ticket, saw the name of a pawn shop in the same neighborhood as Maria's house. "Why didn't you just ask for an advance on your pay, or a loan?" Maria's laugh was hollow, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Mr. Jones, do you know how many houses I clean? 5 different houses, 6 days a week. And still, after rent and food and my mother's other medications, there is never enough. The last time I asked an employer for an advance, I was fired on the spot. She wiped at a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I made a bad choice, I know this, but when you watch someone you love suffer, her voice broke. Jon felt something crack open inside him. He knew exactly what it was like to watch someone suffer, to feel helpless in the face of a disease that took and took and took. He remembered his father's final weeks, how the morphine had been the only thing that kept the pain at bay, how grateful he'd been that they could afford the best care possible. How had he not recognized the same desperation in Maria's eyes? "Your mother," Jon said slowly. "She lives with you." Maria nodded. "Since her diagnosis. She was living in El Salvador, but I brought her here for treatment. Better doctors, they said, but so expensive." She shook her head. "I'm sorry about your watch. It was wrong to take it. I can work off what I owe, or you can call the police." "I understand." Jon thought about the watch, about his father's words. "Time is the only thing you can't get back. Spend it wisely." He thought about the months he'd spent buried in work after Caroline left, the weekends when the silence in the house was so complete he could hear the tick of the grandfather clock from every room. He thought about Maria, working in 6 different houses, caring for a dying mother, making an impossible choice. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around them. In the muted grey light of the stormy afternoon, Jon saw Maria clearly for perhaps the first time, not just as his housekeeper, but as a woman fighting desperately to save someone she loved, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. "I'm not going to call the police," Jon said finally, "and I don't want you to work it off." Relief and confusion mingled on Maria's face. "Then what?" "I want to help," Jon said, surprising himself with the words. "My father died of cancer 7 years ago. I know what you're going through." Maria stared at him, disbelief evident in her expression. "Why would you help me? I stole from you." "Because I've been where you are," Jon said simply. "Not financially, but emotionally. Watching someone you love suffer and not being able to stop it." He paused. "And because I've been sleepwalking through my life for too long." That conversation marked the beginning of a transformation for both of them. Jon went with Maria to retrieve his father's watch from the pawn shop, but insisted on leaving the cash and cufflinks in exchange for something else: time. He reduced Maria's work schedule to twice a week, but maintained her full salary. Other days, he hired her as a caregiver consultant, drawing on her experience to help him establish a foundation that would assist families struggling with the financial burden of cancer treatment. The idea for the foundation had come to Jon in the middle of the night, jolting him from a restless sleep. He'd seen firsthand how even with good insurance and a substantial income, his father's illness had strained his resources. How much worse must it be for people like Maria, working multiple jobs just to keep afloat? The next morning he'd called his law partner, explained his plans to take a partial sabbatical, and started the paperwork. For the first time since his divorce, Jon felt a sense of purpose that went beyond billable hours and corporate mergers. Jon met Maria's mother, Carmen, a former schoolteacher, whose sharp mind remained intact even as her body failed her. Despite the language barrier, Carmen's English was limited and Jon's Spanish was virtually non-existent. They developed a way of communicating through gestures, simple phrases, and Maria's occasional translations. Carmen had a quiet dignity about her, a stoicism in the face of pain that reminded Jon painfully of his father. He brought them groceries, drove them to appointments, and sat with Carmen when Maria needed a break. Sometimes he would arrive to find Carmen teaching him Spanish words, her thin finger pointing at objects around the room, her voice gaining strength as she shared her knowledge. "Mesa," she would say, pointing to the table. "Ventana," for the window. "Amigo," she'd say, pointing at Jon, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. In Carmen's quiet strength and unfailing grace, Jon saw echoes of his own father. And in Maria's devotion, he recognized the person he had once been, before grief and divorce had hardened something inside him. He began to understand that the watch, the thing he'd been so angry about losing, was just an object. The real inheritance from his father wasn't the Rolex, but the lessons about what truly mattered: compassion, connection, how we care for each other in our most vulnerable moments. As weeks turned into months, Jon found himself spending more time at the Blue Bungalow than in his own empty house. He helped Maria install handrails in the bathroom for Carmen, fixed the leaking roof, and repainted the peeling exterior. The neighbors, initially suspicious of the well-dressed white man suddenly appearing in their working-class neighborhood, gradually came to accept his presence. Mrs. Delgado from next door began sending over plates of homemade tamales. Mr. Washington, from across the street, offered the use of his power tools when Jon was making repairs. Sometimes he would arrive to find Maria preparing traditional Salvadoran dishes, the kitchen filled with unfamiliar but enticing aromas. Carmen would insist he stay for dinner, her English improving as she practiced with him. They would eat together at the small kitchen table, and for the first time since his family had fractured, Jon felt something like belonging. One evening, as they finished a meal of pupusas and curtido, Carmen reached for Jon's hand across the table. "You have good heart," she said, her English careful but clear. "God sent you to us." Jon, not traditionally religious, found himself unexpectedly moved. "I think maybe you were sent to me," he replied. It was true, he realized. The day he'd discovered his watch missing had set in motion events that were healing parts of himself he hadn't even realized were broken. During this time, Jon also began reaching out to Emma more consistently. Instead of the perfunctory calls that had become their norm, he started sending her funny text messages throughout the day, asking about her friends, her classes, the books she was reading. At first, her responses were brief, cautious, as if she was waiting for him to retreat back into distraction and work. But gradually, as he persisted, their conversations deepened. "You seem different, Dad," she said during one video call, her eyes studying him carefully. "Less, I don't know, wound up?" Jon smiled. "I'm trying to be more present," he said. "I think I forgot how for a while." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes that made her seem older than her 14 years. "Mum says you're starting some kind of foundation." "Yes," Jon said, surprised that Caroline had mentioned it, "for families dealing with cancer, to help with expenses that insurance doesn't cover. Like what happened with Grandpa." Jon nodded, throat suddenly tight. Emma had been only 7 when his father died, but she'd been remarkably attuned to the emotional currents around her even then. Exactly like that, but for people who don't have the resources we had. Emma was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to help," she said finally. "Maybe I could visit this summer. See what you're doing?" The suggestion sent a wave of joy through Jon that was almost physical in its intensity. "I'd love that, Em, more than anything." Carmen outlived her doctor's 6-month prognosis, making it to 9 months before her condition began to deteriorate rapidly. Jon was there the night she called Maria and him to her bedside. With labored breath, she made them promise to look after each other when she was gone. "Life gives us family by blood," she whispered, holding their hands. "And family by heart. You two are family by heart." The weeks that followed were difficult ones as Carmen's body weakened further. Maria took a leave from her other cleaning jobs, and Jon arranged for a hospice nurse to visit daily. They took turns sitting with Carmen, reading to her, playing her favorite music, or simply holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Jon found himself praying for the first time since his father's illness, not to any specific deity, but to whatever force might ease Carmen's passage and give Maria strength. When Carmen passed away 2 days later, Jon was the one who held Maria. As she collapsed in grief, he handled the funeral arrangements, contacted her extended family, and stood beside her as Carmen was laid to rest. In the weeks that followed, he made sure Maria ate, that she took time to rest, that she knew she wasn't alone. The funeral was small but well attended. Neighbors, patients, and nurses from the oncology center, the other families Maria cleaned for. Jon was struck by how many lives had been touched by this woman, who had seemed so inconsequential to him just months before. One of the oncology nurses approached him afterward, taking his hand warmly. "Carmen talked about you all the time," she said. "She called you her American son." Jon couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, could only nod his thanks. Later, at the reception held in the community center near Maria's house, he found himself surrounded by Carmen's friends from the neighborhood, elderly women who patted his arm and told him stories of how Carmen had taught their children in El Salvador, how she had been known for her generosity even when she had little herself. Grief, Jon discovered, was different this time. With his father, he had retreated into work, avoided the raw edges of his pain. With Carmen, he allowed himself to feel it fully, to share it with Maria and the community that had embraced him. There was still sadness, still the ache of loss, but it was accompanied by a sense of completion, of having been present for every moment, of having no regrets about things left unsaid or undone. 6 months after Carmen's death, Jon sold his too large house and bought a smaller place closer to the city, with a guest house in the back that he invited Maria to live in. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. Not quite family, not quite friends, but a profound connection forged in shared grief and unexpected kindness. The foundation was thriving by then, providing financial assistance to dozens of families facing cancer treatments. Jon had hired a small staff, but remained actively involved, often meeting with families personally, drawing on his legal expertise to help them navigate insurance claims and medical billing issues. Maria worked there part-time, her first-hand experience with caregiving making her invaluable in understanding what families truly needed. Emma had spent the summer with them, initially wary of the new arrangement, but gradually warming to Maria, especially after Maria taught her to make pupusas and shared stories of growing up in El Salvador. By the end of the summer, they were thick as thieves, giggling over inside jokes, Emma practicing her high school Spanish, while Maria gently corrected her pronunciation. On the anniversary of the day, Jon had followed Maria and discovered the truth. They sat together on his patio watching the sunset. Jon wore his father's watch, restored now to its place on his wrist. "I've been thinking about time," he said, glancing down at the watch face. "My father always said it was the one thing you couldn't get back." Maria nodded, her eyes on the deepening colors of the sky. "My mother used to say something similar. That time was God's greatest gift and our greatest responsibility. I think I wasted a lot of mine," Jon admitted. "Working too much, not seeing what was happening to my marriage until it was too late, sleepwalking through the days after Caroline left." "And now?" Maria asked softly. Jon smiled, feeling the weight of his father's watch against his skin. "Now, I think I'm finally spending it wisely." The foundation they had started together was thriving, providing financial assistance to dozens of families facing cancer treatments. Jon had reconnected with his daughter Emma, who was now planning to spend the summer with him, and Maria, who had initially moved into the guest house as a temporary arrangement, had recently begun taking classes at the local community college, pursuing the nursing degree she had always dreamed of. What had begun with suspicion and a missing watch had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. A second chance at connection, at purpose, at family. Jon thought about how close he had come to simply accusing Maria, to calling the police, to never discovering the truth behind the missing items. How easily he might have missed this unexpected chapter of his life. The evening air was soft around them, cicadas beginning their nightly chorus from the garden Maria had planted. Jon thought about how far they had come from that rainy afternoon, when he had stood on her doorstep, anger and suspicion churning inside him. He thought about the moment in the kitchen when he had made the choice not to punish, but to understand. How that one decision had altered the course of both their lives. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Jon realized that some treasures couldn't be stolen or pawned or lost. Some valuable things could only be found when you were brave enough to look beyond appearances, to follow where compassion led, to recognize the humanity in another person's desperate choice. Caroline had called last week, her voice tentative, on the phone. "Emma says you've changed," she'd said, "that you're happier." There had been a question in her words, maybe even a hint of regret. Jon had thought carefully before responding. "I think I'm more myself now," he'd said finally. "Or maybe a better version of myself." After they'd hung up, he'd sat for a long time, turning his father's watch over in his hands, thinking about the ways we measure the passage of time, not just in minutes and hours, but in choices, in connections, in moments of grace. The foundation was planning to expand, to open a small office in the community where Maria had lived with Carmen. They wanted to offer not just financial assistance, but practical support, transportation to appointments, childcare during treatments, meals for families too exhausted to cook. Jon had already consulted with an architect about renovating a storefront, creating a warm, welcoming space where people could find help and hope during the darkest times of their lives. Maria had brought out a photo album recently, showing Jon pictures of Carmen as a young teacher, standing proudly in front of her classroom in El Salvador. She always said education was the greatest gift, Maria had explained, tracing her mother's face in the faded photograph. That knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you. The next day, Jon had contacted his alma mater about establishing a scholarship in Carmen's name for students pursuing careers in healthcare. As darkness settled around them on the patio, a comfortable silence between them, Jon thought about all. The unexpected ways lives could intersect, how a moment of crisis could become a doorway to transformation. He thought about his father's words about time, about Carmen's assertion that they were family by heart. He thought about how sometimes the things we think we've lost can lead us to what we never knew we needed. If this story touched something in you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to be reminded that sometimes what looks like betrayal might actually be the beginning of redemption. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Until next time, remember that the most precious things we own aren't things at all. They're the connections we forge, the compassion we offer, and the time we choose to spend on what truly matters.